Okay, so there's a lot going on in the Russia-Ukraine war, and the mainstream media spins it one way, independent journalists spin it another. I have with me today Colonel Douglas Macgregor to get to the bottom of what's really going on and filter that through a brilliant military mind. Colonel Macgregor, thank you so much for being on today's show.
Sure.
So over the weekend, President Biden confirmed to Ukraine and the other G7 nations that the United States would be offering F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. How wise or dangerous is this move?
Well, your viewers naturally have seen the president state initially what he would not send, and then subsequently backtrack down the line and say, I will send it. I think that we're seeing this happen again with fourth generation aircraft, the F-16. The truth of the matter is the reason he keeps backtracking is that things in Ukraine get worse. Ukrainians are losing more soldiers. Their infrastructure is being destroyed. They're in very bad shape. And so under the circumstances, what you refused to send previously, you now send as a matter of desperation. The problem with the F-16 is twofold. First of all, I don't know how many people they're going to find to fly this anytime soon. Now, what has always concerned me and should concern Americans is the predisposition to put American pilots into those aircraft and fly them in support of the Ukrainians. Now, undoubtedly, that would be a question of calling for volunteers or bringing someone who's recently retired back to do it. The problem with that is that these are then mercenaries, and they are not covered under the Geneva Convention. In other words, they're simply fighters for hire. And that's a serious problem. What do you do if you lose one of these aircraft? And then finally, I think as things get worse, and they're very bad now, and they're only going to get worse, we're back to the temptation to find ways to intervene in Western Ukraine. As it becomes clear this Ukrainian state apparatus is collapsing. And remember, we own it. We pay for everything. We own the government. We're keeping the economy going. We're paying the troops, the bureaucrats, everything. So once that weakens, the whole thing is going to fall like a house of cards. So I worry that someone will say, well, let's go in, with our own forces. The Russians wouldn't dare to challenge us. And of course, they're wrong. I think for many Russians who are extremely angry with us and the terrible damage that we have caused them by turning Ukraine into this platform for attack against Russia, they would welcome the opportunity to crush any U.S. forces that intervened, or for that matter, any NATO forces that did. So I hope we put that out of our minds, but I worry about that.
Would that be like a coalition of nations, or specifically like Poland, or who do you think might make a move? And could they justify, like Poland saying, hey, this used to be our territory anyway, we're kind of just taking it back now that Ukraine can't stand on its own two legs?
Well, everybody in Eastern Europe can make that assertion and have some credibility. If you go to this thing they call Kaliningrad, which is the very corner of East Prussia, that was German from about 1220 onwards. So you're talking, 850 years nonstop German. It's now part of Russia, thanks to FDR. Stalin, as his armies moved west, said, hey, we'd really like to have that port in the Baltic. Do you have any objections? And FDR said, no, of course not, Joe, take it. So now we have Russians sitting there where no one in their right mind wanted them. But the bottom line is that, sure, you can always find the Hungarians, the Poles, any numbers of people that have controlled territory that's now under somebody else's authority. So that's part of it. But I think the bigger issue is this. Whenever we go anywhere, we always go as a quote unquote coalition. We have that as the fig leaf of legitimacy. But the truth is that other than the Poles, maybe some Romanians, although I have my doubts, and maybe a few Brits, the United States is going to be on its own if it goes into Western Ukraine. Now, it could be some of the Lithuanians want to go along. I don't know. That could be. But even in Poland, the enthusiasm for this fiasco is waning. The most recent polling data says that the Poles are tired of being overwhelmed by Ukrainian refugees. They're openly talking about the Ukrainianization of their country, which they dislike intensely. And the Polish chief of staff has said, look, the Russians are not incompetent. They're tough soldiers. They're very competent. They know what they're doing. So I see evidence that people are sobering up. The question is, will we sober up? And I don't see any evidence for it. Just as you have people that absolutely refuse in Washington to believe that there could be a serious economic turndown. In other words, that there is a cost associated with money printing and tightening credit and rising interest rates. You can also find lots of people in Washington say, oh, the Russians are nothing. We're everything. We're invincible, invulnerable. It's very dangerous. So I see that here. I don't know how deeply that runs, but if you looked at some of the more recent articles that have come out, there's a lot of evidence that what I would call common sense and reality, those things don't really intrude very much at the highest levels of the Biden administration.
Yeah. Well, if Europe doesn't make a move, we sure know that Wall Street is going to make a move. BlackRock is already meeting with Zelenskyy and talking about how they can, revitalize, bring life back, and how there's just so much money to be made. And I find it disgusting how, they look at this as just such a great money-making opportunity when there's human life on the line.
Well, remember, the people that you're talking about here in Washington, or the financiers in Europe and the United States, whether it's Soros or Larry Fink at BlackRock, they're not interested in Ukrainians. They could care less. They have been very hopeful that Russia could be destroyed so that they could strip Russia of its resources. Remember, you're talking about an area from sort of the middle of Ukraine all the way to Kamchatka, the peninsula, that is full of extraordinary resources. Everything from gold mines to extraordinarily rare minerals and rare earths and endless quantities of fresh water, wonderful soil, an abundance of food. We could go on and on and on. So I think that's really been behind much of what we see in this sort of proxy war waged against Russia. Now, I don't see any evidence that Russia is going to collapse, and I think Putin will probably be president long after Biden has vanished from the scene. But it's still dangerous, and we'll have to see what happens to the rest of Ukraine. But you've just hit on a very important point that all the people viewing this should keep in mind. If you're a Russian right now and you look at the situation, you've taken, contrary to what the mainstream media says, comparatively few casualties. I mean, you have an exchange rate of about 1 Russian killed for every 7 Ukrainians killed. So that's a pretty favorable ratio. Nobody likes to lose anybody in war, but that's a good position to be in. Just as Ukraine is now scraping the bottom of the barrel, running out of manpower, they're actually dragging back about 30 to 35,000 Ukrainians training in Germany, Canada, the United States, the Czech Republic, other places, back to Ukraine to become the foundation for this so-called counteroffensive that they want to, execute. And the rest of them, though, unfortunately, are just being shanghaied into the military. You're talking about a lot of young boys, a lot of old men, and so forth. Russia's in a different position. Russia's stronger than ever. Russia is actually peaking in its capability. If you look at its forces, they've really learned a great deal over the last year plus. In other words, if we look at the initial Russian forces that went in, like any army that has not seen action for a very long time, they made mistakes. But they learned from those mistakes. And there's a great report out from the Royal United Services Institute. It still has stupid things in it about the Russians lacking initiative and all that, but brush that aside and just look at what they talk about in terms of adaptation and innovation. And you see that the Russians have really produced a very, very fine force. And they're better now than they've ever been, and they're larger now than they've ever been, and they have more modern equipment, more experience. So when they are finally released and allowed to execute, and I think they're waiting for the Ukrainians to expel, sort of exhaust the last forces at their disposal on another pointless counterattack. Once that happens, they're in the driver's seat. So why would they sit idly by and allow us to intervene, or even worse, bother to negotiate with us. You know, the Politico article that came out over the weekend said that behind the scenes in Washington, the Biden administration, White House, State Department, people are now talking about a frozen conflict as the best outcome. Now think about that. These are people in Washington who want to turn Ukraine into Korea, create a DMZ, and of course, then they want to park their forces in Western Ukraine on the other side of the Dnieper River, staring at the Russians. Or better yet, if the Russians would accept such a thing, they'll cross the river up in northern Ukraine and sit there. Russians will never accept that. It's out of the question. They have been fighting to demilitarize Ukraine, eliminate the armed forces there that threaten them, and then secondly, they want this place to be neutral. So the idea that these people at the top could look forward to some sort of Korea-like division of Ukraine and that they might be satisfied with that is a manifestation of how utterly uninformed and ridiculous they are. I mean, it just makes no sense. They're not listening to the Russians. They're not acknowledging reality.
Well, they're still trying to push this narrative that this was an unprovoked attack versus a decade of building up and provoking Putin to the point where he felt like my only option is to create this buffer zone. And unfortunately, Ukraine has to become that buffer zone. Let's move on to Bakhmut for a minute. Russia says Bakhmut has fallen. Zelenskyy says, no, it hasn't. We still have soldiers in the area fighting. And until we run out of bodies, this area is not taken. How does the battle for Bakhmut show how military strategies and goals can change over time? And in your opinion, has Bakhmut fallen into the hands of Russia?
Well, Bakhmut, 90% of it has been in Russian hands now for months. It's only this small sliver of land on the very edge that remained in Ukrainian hands. And they occupied some concrete reinforced buildings, very large, sort of high-rise-like buildings. And the Russians were very reluctant to destroy them because they had information that there were Russian civilians in the basements. We have to understand that you're operating in a part of Ukraine where the population is really Russian. Now, they may have been Ukrainian citizens, but of course, Ukrainians treated them badly, didn't allow them to speak their language, have their schools, worship as they saw fit. They did not have equal rights before the law. They were an oppressed minority. And every time someone that was Russian would complain, look, I'm a Ukrainian citizen. I'm happy to do whatever. Just give me my equal rights. They said, well, there's a country. It's called Russia. You can leave here and go there. So the Russians did not want to kill large numbers of Russian civilians in eastern Ukraine. That slows everything down. It has slowed everything down from the beginning. People don't get it. That's been a major constraint on the conduct of Russian military operations. Secondly, they then saw virtue in necessity to some extent. Remember, Surovikin comes in. He's from the aerospace forces. He takes over the theater in the fall, completely changes the chain of command, streamlines it, creates unity of command. And he decides that as long as the Russians are building up their forces for future operations against Ukrainians, that he's going to run now what I would call a relatively elastic defense, an economy of force operation. In other words, to use minimal force to maintain control of the areas that the Russians have, while at the same time enticing the Ukrainians in to fight, inviting them in essentially to attack. Bakhmut suddenly became very attractive to him. We now know from what Mr. Prigozhin has said and other Russian sources have said that he deliberately used Bakhmut as sort of a red flag for the Ukrainian bull and kept those roads open and the opportunity for Ukrainians to reinforce it. Now, we see a lot of evidence that upwards of 50,000 Ukrainian soldiers were killed in and around Bakhmut. That's a huge number of people. We know at least that many were wounded. And the bad news with a lot of the Ukrainian wounded is that they never returned to duty. So just, the Russians have been pretty good at getting somewhere around 70 to 80% of their soldiers back to the front lines after a couple of months of recuperation. The Ukrainians have been unable to do that for a whole range of reasons. So the losses were really staggering. And I think it is not an exaggeration to suggest that Bakhmut really is the graveyard of the Ukrainian army. And Zelenskyy's obsession with Bakhmut is on par with Hitler's obsession with Stalingrad. And what people don't understand is that the Germans didn't have to have or occupy or control Stalingrad. Long before the Sixth Army even arrived on the Volga River, the only thing of value in Stalingrad was an aircraft factory, a place where the Russians were literally building fighters. That was destroyed by the German Air Force. There was really no reason to, overreach with your forces and go that far east. But then Hitler did it. He was sort of attracted to this. Well, it's called Stalingrad. So this is a kind of strategic grudge match with Stalin. And Stalin, said, we're not leaving Stalingrad, and fed more and more and more troops in there. Of course, the difference was that he could afford 1 million casualties. The Germans could not. So the bottom line is Zelenskyy has treated Bakhmut in the same way. It becomes the symbol of Ukrainian resistance. And I think we're probably equally guilty of encouraging him to do that. And instead of being a symbol of resistance, it was just a sponge for blood. And that's why, I think in retrospect, 2, 3, 4 years from now, people will look back on this war and they will say, well, Bakhmut was a huge turning point because the Ukrainians couldn't replace their losses. They couldn't replace all the equipment losses. And the Russians took very few casualties and lost almost no equipment. The outcome was a catastrophe for Ukraine. And I think that's pretty clear. But of course, the mainstream media has its script. They're going to continue to read from it. They're not going to tell you the truth. And until you have, I really say this all the time, and it's depressing to me, but I guess until you have Russian forces on the west side of the Dnieper and they overrun Odessa and they move north and take Kharkov, people will finally recognize, my goodness, what happened to the great victory? What happened to the inevitable Ukrainian success story? Then maybe people will wise up.
Yeah.
I don't.
Bakhmut, in the beginning was like a beacon of hope. This will decide the war, and then as they began to lose, top military in the United States began to say, "Oh, this is just one of many cities, one of many battles." But as you say, it's stopped being a symbol of hope and has become a sponge for blood.